You are listening to the first segment of our four-part series, Using Your Weeds, with Susan Weed at Time Monk Radio. Hello, Susan. Welcome back to Time Monk Radio.
Green blessings, Gemini. Thank you so much for inviting me here again.
Well, we're glad to have you.
It's beginning to feel like home.
Wonderful. Thank you. And tonight I understand that we're going to be discussing weeds, as in don't pull them and using them.
One of my favorite topics, weeds. So perhaps I should tell you how I got involved with weeds.
Yes, please.
Because I think it's a rather amusing story. And it starts back in 1965 when I was at UCLA. And I started taking birth control pills. And after I'd taken birth control pills for a month, I, of course, had to go every month and get my prescription renewed every month. I said to the doctor, I said, I think I might be pregnant. And the doctor, who was a woman doctor, looked at me and said, whatever makes you think that? Did you take one of these pills every single day? I said, every single day I took a pill, every day. She said, then you can't be pregnant. Why do you think you're pregnant? I said, well, I gained some weight. She said, well, that's very common, taking these pills. I said, especially in my breast. She said, oh, that's definitely a side effect of the pills. I said, and I didn't, I guess I bled a little bit, but it didn't really seem like a menses. She said, well, those are all just total side effects of the pills, and it does make women kind of feel like they're pregnant, but if you took one every day, don't worry. Well, this went on, to make it somewhat short, 4 or 5 months, until I actually went to a different doctor who actually almost refused to examine me, saying if I'd been taking birth control pills for 5 months, I certainly couldn't be 5 months pregnant, and I surely didn't look 5 months pregnant. But when he actually examined me, he discovered that I was indeed 5 months pregnant. And I will admit to being a bit of an exhibitionist, but I'm not so much of an exhibitionist that when I went for my prenatal exams at UCLA, that it was okay with me that there were 20 interns in the room looking at my you-know-what. Because, of course, there was no sonograms then, and nobody had any idea what was going to happen to the baby of the woman who'd been taking birth control pills for 5 months. So I escaped to Manhattan, all the way across the country, to the big, bad apple, and found myself one day walking up those big stone steps with big stone lions at the Manhattan Public Library, still pregnant, and, suffering some of the minor consequences of being pregnant, a little, difficulty with digestion because your guts are all squeezed up, and a little, difficulty with it at the other end, too, because everything is squished down there, and a little ache in the side, and nothing big or major, but just kind of, I would have liked to have been more comfortable in. I can't really tell you why at that point. I couldn't tell you why. I found myself compelled to go to that library and walk up to the library and say, I need to have some books on herbs. Now, decades later, one of my favorite aunts, Aunt Vicky, I love you, Aunt Vicky, even though you're not around, told me that my great-grandmother was the village herbalist in Switzerland. So we both kind of think it was her, like whispering in my ear. At any rate, there were, in the entire Manhattan Public Library, 4 books about herbs. And with all humbleness, I do admit that I have written 5 at this point. And they have my name, not on the front, but on the back cover of probably 500 written by my friends and apprentices and students. So there was not a lot of real information for me. Oh, and yes, 3 of those 4 books said that I should put basil with my tomatoes and dill with my cucumbers, which is very good advice. Just wasn't the advice I was looking for. So I had my baby, my daughter Justine, who works with me now, the head of my virtual operations, and oversees the work of the Wise Woman Web, a wonderful group of women who allow us to have a very, very vibrant online presence. And after a couple of years, managed to make my way to upstate New York, to a town people said to me, there's this little town upstate, and there's a lot of really interesting people up there, and you should go and check it out. Well, of course, the town is called Woodstock. And so in 1968, we moved up to Woodstock. And like many people in this area, had kind of one foot in the city and one foot in the country, and kind of had to go back and forth for a while. But didn't stop me from having a garden to grow my basil and my dill, because at least by that time I had discovered that if you were going to put basil with your tomatoes and dill with your cucumbers, which is a good idea, they should be fresh, not dried. And imagine my surprise after starting this garden when all these things started growing in it. Maybe some of them were the seeds I had planted. But I wasn't really quite sure what was what. And nowadays, many seed packages actually have a little illustration of what the seedling looks like, because the seedling looks, of course, completely different from the plant. And when everything is just sprouting and it's all seedlings, it's pretty hard to tell what you got growing there. And, of course, then I didn't have any such props or aids, so just because I didn't want to pull out my basil and my dill, I let everything grow. And I had the wonderful advantage at this point in the very late 60s, very early 70s, to be influenced by two people through their writings. One, Joseph Kochenauer, with his book Weeds and Guardians of the Soil, and the other one, Ewell Gibbons, in Seeking the Wild Asparagus. And these two writers allowed me almost immediately to understand that the plants that were growing that I hadn't planted were probably just as important, if not more important, than the basil and the dill. Now, that's not to say that I don't still grow basil and sometimes dill and try to make a place for it in my garden. And yes, of course, give it its space. But I will also say that I cherish more than anything the weeds in my garden. I cherish the weeds in my garden for a variety of reasons. What was the name of Joseph Kochenauer's book? Weeds, Guardians of the Soil. So far from what many people would have you believe, that the weeds are stealing the nutrition from the plants. In fact, in many instances, the weeds are feeding nutrition to the plants. We'll come back and talk more about that. The weeds also give me food, and they give me plenty of food. I'm usually harvesting food from the weeds in my gardens as soon as the snow is cleared. The nettle starts coming up. We start having nettle soup. Chickweed starts springing up. We start having chickweed in our salads. There are all kinds of weeds that are there for us to eat. And we eat those weeds, as I said, from the time that the snow melts until the time that the ground is covered with snow. And we will definitely come back to weeds as food. And, of course, those weeds are medicine. Some of the most medicinal herbs grow as free weeds in the garden. To mention one of the stars, dandelion. Dandelion is renowned everywhere in the world for its amazing ability to heal, nourish, and put to rights the entire digestive system, but especially the liver. And we will certainly come back to that as well. I could also, if I wanted to, include the fact that weeds can provide beauty for us, that they provide wildlife habitat as well, and that those of my friends who work in the fiber arts would remind me that the weeds in my garden are also dye plants. So just to start off with, we can see that the weeds in our garden, as I learned from Yule Gibbons and Joseph Kochenauer, are truly amazing sources of nutrition for us and nutrition for the soil as well. It's wonderful at this point to see people kind of getting, what we might call turned back on to weeds because times are a little hard and people are looking once again toward the wild foods and what kinds of things are there in their environment to eat. So through the times that we're going to be together over this month, I want to look at the weeds in our garden and to have what I call the gardener's best revenge, and to see how we can use the different parts of these weedy plants as well, to see if there might not be certain advantages to having them there, and how to keep them from being weeds, I sometimes say. And let me see if I can put this very simply. A weed's basic job is to sprout, grow, flower, have seeds, and get out of the way for its children. Many of the weedy plants that we deal with are annuals, so they just have that spurt of growth, and they just want to grow straight up. Lamb's quarter, just a favorite weed of mine, is a plant very much like this. Left to its own devices, it will simply grow straight up in a big bunch where they're all narrowly packed together and have a few little flowers and a few little seeds at the top and not very many leaves at all. But if you treat that lamb's quarter as though it were a garden vegetable and thin it out just like you would, you wouldn't let your cabbages grow that close together. Thin them out, give them some space, Pinch off the tops of all those little sprouting baby lamb's quarters and throw them in your salads and really give space for one big mother of a lamb's quarter to grow. And as it grows, keep pinching it off at the top. Again, just as we would do with, say, our cultivated basil. And you will get, instead of just this skinny, spindly little lamb's quarter plant with all of its many, 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 many cousins growing together, you'll get this big, enormous lamb's quarter bush. I've had them sometimes be, a meter high by a meter wide in good, rich soil. And that is producing an enormous amount of greens, which I use both in my salads and as a cooked green. I especially like lamb's quarters greens cooked. They have a kind of a little chalky taste in the salad, which some people like, and I don't dislike, but it's not yummy. Whereas it really mellows when it cooks, and it produces an enormous amount of seeds. And we're going to be talking in the coming weeks about the seeds of the weeds. It's the part that people sometimes don't even really think about, especially gardeners that I've talked to who have been taught never to let their weeds go to seed. And so for them to be thinking about the usefulness of the seeds of their weedy plants seems to them to be almost a contradiction in dealing with weeds. But especially for the lamb's quarter that we're talking about, which is Chenopodium album or other related species that generally grow in gardens, there is a cultivated variety of Chenopodium, and that is Chenopodium quinoa. And if you're going, quinoa, yes, quinoa, Q-U-I-N-O-A, quinoa is the grain from South America. I read today that 1 in 3 Americans had decided to reduce the amount of gluten in their diet, and quinoa is a fabulous alternative to grains that contain gluten, because quinoa does not contain any gluten. It is not, technically speaking, a grain because it's not the seed of a grass. It is, as I just stated, the seed of a weed, and a leafy weed at that. And from a well-tended lamb's quarter plant, I can get almost a pound of seed. If you know anything at all about quinoa, you know that the seed from lamb's quarter or lamb's quarter quinoa is one of the most nutritious seeds that we can eat, having a very well representative amount of amino acids in it, having a lavish amount of B vitamins, being a highly mineralized seed, and of course, like many seeds, not just flaxseed, but a great many seeds, the seeds of quinoa and lamb's quarters are very rich in omega-3 fatty acids, which fight inflammation throughout the body. So we're going to be looking at specific weeds that we have in our gardens and seeing ways that we can use them. And we're going to be looking at them in groups. I'm going to be talking about using the leaves of your weeds. Which weeds do you have that you should focus on the leaves of them, and how to use those leaves in a variety of different ways, from food to medicine to uses for the soil and so on. And similarly, we are going to look at the flowers, the seeds, and the roots of the weeds, and we're going to group the plants together in that way by looking at those that we're going to focus on the roots, those that we're going to focus on the seeds, those that we're going to focus on the flowers. And you will see, of course, that there are certain stars, like lamb's quarter and dandelion, that keep coming up over and over again, because there are some plants out there that, about 35 years ago, somebody sent me a cartoon. And this cartoon attempted to mimic a real ad, and it said, "Special weed seeds for sale. Dandelion, nettle, lamb's quarter, amaranth, mullein, chickweed, chicory, yellow dock." There were all of the medicinal plants, which are, of course, weeds, in this cartoon. But nowadays, there really are places where you can buy the seeds of all of these plants, and not just a few strange places where you can buy the seeds of these weeds. And I hope that as we go through our month together, talking about weeds, that if you don't need to take revenge on any weed around you, that you might just fall in love with it and might want to invite it into your garden anyhow. I will tell you, however, that sometimes, at least in my experience, the seeds that are being sold are really not quite as, shall we say, adaptable and hardy as the wild plants. So let me suggest to you that if you do have longings and yearnings for any of the plants that I'm talking about, and you don't find them as weeds in your garden, that you call them. And that doesn't necessarily have to be out loud, but if the neighbors wouldn't object, you certainly could go out and say, "Purslane, oh, Purslane, I want you here. Purslane, please, come to me, come to me." But you could also just go outside and sit on the ground and think that, and Purslane would get the idea. You can put your hands on the ground. You can look at pictures of Purslane. You really envision, where would Purslane grow? Where could Purslane grow on my land? What does Purslane like? How can I make an environment that Purslane would love, or whatever weed it is that you want. I have, and many of my students have found it incredibly successful to call a plant to you, yes, even a plant that maybe wouldn't necessarily grow where you are, because we have all kinds of microclimates around our houses, and something that might need to be a little cooler or a little warmer than the general area where you live might just find that little cooler or that little warmer spot right by you where it can start to grow. So as I said, One of the people who really turned me on to weeds was Joseph Kochenauer in his book, Weeds, Guardians of the Soil. He relates a story from his boyhood, and his boyhood was in the 20s and 30s in the Midwest in the United States. And he said that as a young man, he earned his pocket change by hoeing puzzly. In other words, he went out to the cornfields of the Midwest with a hoe, and he chopped from among the roots of the corn, the puzzly, which is their local name for purslane, Portulaca oleracea. And it was known in that area that there was one farmer who let the puzzly grow among his corn. And I want you to imagine this with me, because maybe you don't know what purslane looks like. I'm going to bet you know what corn looks like, but let's just go through this anyhow. So corn is generally a fairly large plant. Even when it emerges from the ground, it's pretty big. It doesn't come up a tiny little thing. It comes up this pretty big shoot, and within a week, it's like starting to grow. It's taken off like a green rocket. And the places where it grows can get real hot in summers and really kind of droughty too. And the corn doesn't have much lateral spread. As I said, it's like this green rocket. It just kind of grows up. The leaves do kind of bend down eventually and do give the roots a little bit of shelter. And the corn roots, they actually come up out of the ground. They're kind of like props to help prop up this big skyscraper of a plant that would just be blown over by the wind if it didn't have these extra props, as well as the part that goes down. And those can get pretty easily like sunburned or dehydrated. And so a lot of corn, it's kind of hard to get it like real good. And when you hoe that puzzly, when you chop that puzzly out of there, well, it can hurt those corn roots as well. And what does the purslane look like? The purslane looks like a succulent plant. It looks like it should be growing somewhere in Arizona or New Mexico, someplace where it is real hot and real deserty, and it just looks very strange in the kind of places that it grows, which is cornfields and gardens throughout much of the temperate regions of the world. Pretty common garden weed, in fact, from the south to the north, from the east to the west, and it rarely rises up any more than about a hand span, maybe 4 or 5 inches. Much of the time, if it has the space to do it, it will just spread out across the ground. It doesn't even really like to pick its head up. It likes to just mat across the ground. It has these fleshy, thick, reddish stalks and fleshy, thick leaves, kind of oval-shaped, stuck on those stalks, inconspicuous yellow flowers. And it is one amazing plant, this purslane. But we'll get back to that. Forward to that as we move through our month together talking about weeds. Let's get back to Joseph Kochenauer's story and how he discovered that weeds were the guardians of the soil. So, summer after summer, he hoed the puzzly from the cornfields, except for this one farmer who never hoed his puzzly out of his cornfield. And finally, young Joseph, getting a bit older, got up the courage and the nerve to go and talk to that farmer and say to him just straight out, how come you don't hoe the puzzly out of your cornfields, and what kind of yield do you get? Because everybody here thinks if you let the puzzly grow, it's going to ruin your corn yield. And this farmer said to him, well, it just never seemed to me that puzzly was much of a problem with the corn. It actually seemed like it kind of shaded the roots, and it shaded the soil. It kept the soil nice and moist underneath there. He said, I don't know, I think my yield's a little better than most people's. I wouldn't want to argue with anybody about it, but I certainly don't see that it's having any problem at all. Well, our young Joseph kind of stored that information and graduated high school and went off to college. And was very interested in the garbage piles of human beings and in the plant uses of human beings. And he began to realize through all of his studies and what he was being taught that it was all focused on the major cultivated plants, and that he thought that there was probably some in-between thing where people were not maybe specifically cultivating those plants. In other words, they were still weeds, just like the weeds in my garden, but certainly what I described with the lamb's quarter could be called a kind of cultivation with the plant. Now, I know where the purslane likes to grow on my land, and I like purslane. And purslane likes bare land, which is one of the reasons it comes to gardens, because people often leave bare soil around their plants, and so purslane loves to be there. Or in a plowed field seeded with corn, so that is often a very bare area. And this year, such a lush year, it's been so warm and so much rain, it's almost tropical-like, I actually had to go out to my usual bare areas and start weeding out the grass so that I would be sure to get a little purslane growing here this year. So again, that's kind of a way of cultivation, isn't it? That's what we do with a cultivated plant. We give it an edge. We give it a preference. And as Joseph Kochenauer moved into this understanding, as he looked at what ancient people had left behind, he also began to deeply appreciate what the weeds do for the soil and how they led to these other cultivated crops. One of the first things that he draws to our attention is that even though they are annuals and don't need much of a root, many of those weeds actually do send a fairly significant root down past the first few inches of the soil and down into subsoil mineral-rich regions. Those plants then, through their roots, bring those minerals, those mineral richnesses up into their leaves, their flowers, and their seeds. Now, what did I say that plant's goal is? That plant's goal is to come up, have leaves, have flowers, have seeds, and die. And what does die mean? That means all of that material that was made from the minerals that was in the subsoil has now come up to the top of the soil, and because the plant has died, it has laid all of that richness, all of that food for the plants now on top of the soil, where the soil microorganisms, which live only in the very topmost part of the soil, can interact with it and make those minerals now into forms which are available to the roots of the other plants, yes, the other weeds, but also our other cultivated plants as well. So Joseph Kochenauer asks us to think about our weeds as mechanisms for fertilizing our gardens. Certainly, we don't want to give them the upper hand, and putting weeds into the compost pile is also an excellent use of them. One of the things that I often do with my weeds is I feed them to my rabbits. I find my rabbits are just a wonderful way of integrating my garden weeds into my life. Now, granted, I don't really need to put my garden weeds into my compost pile because the rabbits provide me with a very high-quality manure mixed with the straw that I put in their cages, and that just turns into a beautiful compost. I have some worms out there with it, and of course the same leavings from my goats. But even if you just had rabbits, it would make that full circle. So we feed the weeds to the rabbits, then we take the rabbit droppings and we turn those into compost, and we use that compost to feed the plants and the weeds. And meanwhile, the weeds that I can't eat, the things that I am going to remove or take from the garden, like the grass and other plants that are too coarse or texturally unappetizing for me, I can feed to the rabbits, and the rabbits can then feed back to me as they in turn become food in the circle, in the movement of life and death. The weeds in our garden move through us, move into us, improve the soil, feed the soil, feed us, give us medicine, give us beauty, our wonderful wildlife habitat, provide dye plants. We are going to be enjoying so many exciting times together this month. And if your curiosity has been whetted, come and visit me at susanweed.com. The whole website's full of amazing free information for you. And if you want more than that, you might want to visit my mentorship site, which is wisewomanmentor.com, where we can have a one-on-one relationship, and I can help you in a variety of ways. You can find my books at my wisewomanbookshop.com. And the Wise Woman Bookshop has all 5 of my books. Wise Woman Herbal for the Childbearing Year, my Big Green Herbal for Everybody Healing Wise, my Big Blue Herbal for Everybody Down There, Breast Cancer, Breast Health, The Wise Woman Way, and my bestseller, New Menopausal Years, The Wise Woman Way. And this is Susan Weed wishing you green blessings until we are together again.
Thank you, Susan.
You're so welcome, Gemini. Oh, what a fun time I always have here with you all.
Thank you. We so enjoy it. This completes the first segment of our 4-part series, Using Your Weeds with Susan Weed at Time Monk Radio.